All right, folks, welcome back. Looks like we're moving into section 3, cultural constructs and gender difference. Um, this is going to really look at many of the impacts of culture across time, across cultures, and the importance of that to the construction of gender roles. Previous chapter was looking at anatomy as being destiny, nature as being destiny. Um, but this particular chapter is going to argue that anatomy is not destiny. As you read through this chapter, you found that biological explanations, however popular over time, certainly do not and cannot account for the diverse array of gendered experiences that we find across cultures and across the planet, different times in our development, and how that changes, how time can actually change what is once acceptable and turn it into no longer acceptable, and vice versa. And how those identities that are constructed based on these gender characteristics vary over place, time, and culture as well. And of course, from person to person. As we saw in this chapter, there are varied ways that societies experience and interpret and value gender differences. Sometimes you find dichotomy, this binary or dichotomous relationship of gender, male versus female. But in other cultures, you find three different defined gender characters, if you will: male, female, and then what might be a conglomeration of both male and female, called the third gender. Once again, anatomy is not destiny. Culture does matter. Culture being learned behavior. It's what culture actually is. And even though these biological models assume this innate biological difference and how that biological difference leads to behavioral differences, we find as we move forward to find out that culture is really the driving force primarily. When we think about this anthropologically, the research that arose in response to the biological determinism, that research that comes from Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead being an extremely important scientific figure in the 20th century. One that really defined the struggle for equality for women, and debunked many of the historical scientific interpretations of natural predispositions of man. Margaret Mead, amongst others, argues that the biological models projected Western values onto other cultures. And as we've found over time in the development of science and the construction of studies, the interpretation of findings, we have to be very, very careful to not allow our ethnocentrism to define what we're finding in other cultures. Those cultures and what they value is valuable in and of itself, even if it's not seen as valued from the eyes of a Western scientific perspective. Biology does give us building blocks, but once we have those building blocks, then it's culture, societies, family, education, these important institutions that truly define what gender really is. As I said earlier, there are certain variations in gender definitions, especially as we begin to get outside of our own parent cultures. We tend to see the world in reference to our world in particular. And that's how we define what's good and bad, is this is what happens in our world. And when we encounter things that are contrary to what happens in our world, we are forced to question, and in many respects, question the foundations of our own upbringing. And that tends to be hard for cultures that have been around and have come up with value and norm systems and justified those values and norms through the construction of their social society. But as I mentioned earlier, Margaret Mead, she's really one of the pioneers that forces science to look at the differences in gender opportunities throughout cultures throughout the world. She specifically focuses in on three primitive societies. She came up with a book, Sex and the Temperament of Three Primitive Societies, and she found that there are differences in how these societies construct gender definitions. The Arapesh culture, all members were passive, gentle, emotionally warm, and shared child rearing, which is extremely important in how women's opportunities are defined within many cultures, and was somewhat utopian. The Mundugamor culture, both sexes equally aggressive and violent. Women were not nurturing, and they exhibited many of the characteristics that you would find in one-sex dominant societies, like jealousy and things like that. And then the Chumbuli culture, which the differences were noted. One sex was nurturing and gossipy. The other would adorn to attract, and the others were providers. So there's variance within the scientific findings, but we see this variance in our society as well. It doesn't take long, and you don't have to look far to find out that that society is that gender and how it's accounted for in any given society is nuanced at best, right? You can find different gender roles and people accepting different gender roles within almost any society that you find yourself looking at. One of the most defining characteristics of gender is the gender division of labor. In almost every society, labor is divided by gender. What that means is that certain tasks are reserved for women and others are reserved for men. And how this gender division of labor takes place is really impacting on the types of power that women might find within a given culture. The functionalists argued that this was a characteristic of a functioning society, that sex-based division of labor was functionally necessary to hold society together. Women would do certain tasks, men would do other tasks, and this was necessary in a complex society. It might not have been as necessary in the hunter-gatherer communities, but as we moved into as we moved from Gemeinschaft, as Durkheim called it, to Gesellschaft, so we're moving from small societies in communities to larger societies, more developed societies based on the specialization of labor and the complexity uh, of society itself. So as we become more complex, a division of labor is going to be necessary in order for societies to continually reproduce themselves. But if this idea was ever based on a biological imperative and a functional necessity, we may have moved past that. These centuries-long social customs and traditions which dictate gender and normative behavior today might not be as important as they once were when we were laying out the foundations for societies in the first place. And this has led us to today where the functionally necessary divisions of labor based on gender are no longer necessary, and what we're really looking at is the power of one sex over another, the power of a dominant subordinate relationship with males being dominant and females being subordinate.